My family laughed at my small business until Forbes listed me as a millionaire. Marie, we need to talk about this hobby of yours. My brother David's voice cut through the Thanksgiving dinner chatter like a blade through silk. The entire table went quiet, my mother pausing mid-bite of turkey, my sister Rachel setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision, and my father looking up from his plate with that familiar expression of barely concealed disappointment. Kept my fork steady, cutting through the cranberry sauce on my plate with military precision. 23 years in the Army had taught me to maintain composure under fire, even when that fire came from family. Which hobby would that be, David? To me. Little craft thing you're doing in your garage. He gestured vaguely with his hand, dismissing months of 18-hour days with a wave. Mom says you're calling it a business now? My mother, Patricia, dabbed at her lips with her napkin and gave me that look, the one she'd perfected when I announced I was enlisting instead of going to college like Rachel. Sweetheart, we're just concerned. You're 47 years old. Maybe it's time to think about something more stable? Rachel's firm is always looking for administrative assistants. Administrative assistant? I took a slow sip of water, remembering the last time I'd been in Rachel's gleaming downtown law office, watching her assistants shuffle papers and fetch coffee for partners who made more in a month than most people saw in a year. Rachel had made it clear that she could pull some strings to get me settled in something appropriate for someone of my background. The garage business, my father, chimed in, his voice carrying that tone he'd used when I was 12 and insisted I could fix the lawnmower myself. Marie, honey, you've got good intentions, but let's be realistic here. You make what? A few $100s a month selling those little bags online? The little bags. If they only knew that those little bags were tactical gear prototypes that I'd been designing based on 23 years of field experience, failures I'd witnessed that cost lives, equipment that broke when soldiers needed it most. Every stitch was informed by memories of gear that failed in Afghanistan, of packs that ripped when carrying wounded comrades, of organizational systems that meant the difference between life and death in combat zones. It's not really sustainable, Rachel added, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd learned in law school. I mean, competing with established companies? Amazon? REI? You're fighting giants, Marie. And honestly, after everything you've been through with the PTSD and adjusting back to civilian life, maybe something less stressful would be better. PTSD. She always brought that up, like my service had somehow broken me, made me incapable of rational thought or business decisions. Like the nightmares I'd worked through in therapy somehow invalidated every strategic decision I'd made, every late night I'd spent perfecting designs that could save lives. My nephew Tyler, Rachel's 16-year-old son, looked up from his phone, long enough to add his contribution. Aunt Marie, my friend's mom tried to start a business too. She ended up losing like $10,000 and had to go back to working at Target. The table erupted in knowing nods and murmurs of agreement. This was the narrative they'd constructed around my life. The damaged veteran who couldn't quite figure out how to function in the real world, who'd latched onto some naive dream of entrepreneurship because she couldn't handle a normal job. The thing is, David continued, reaching for the wine bottle, you've always been stubborn. Remember when you insisted on joining the Army instead of getting a teaching degree like Mom wanted? Look how that turned out. 2 decades of service, 3 deployments, a Bronze Star, and a medical retirement after. An IED took out half my unit and left me with a titanium rod in my left leg. But to them, it was just another example of my poor judgment, my inability to listen to reason. We just want what's best for you, my mother said, her voice softening in that way that made her criticism sound like love. You could move back home, save money on rent. Rachel could get you that administrative position, and you could have a steady paycheck, benefits, maybe even start dating again. There's no shame in admitting when something isn't working. Move back home. At 47, after surviving Kandahar and Fallujah, after building something from nothing in a garage that most people dismissed as a shed, after creating designs that were already being quietly tested by units whose names couldn't be spoken at dinner tables like this. "The military pension isn't enough to live on," my father added, cutting into his turkey with surgical precision. "And this garage thing. Marie, you're not getting any younger. You need security." Security. The word hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. They thought security meant a steady paycheck from someone else's dream, a cubicle, in someone else's building, gratitude for someone else's scraps. They couldn't see that security could be built with your own hands, designed with your own mind, earned through your own sacrifice. My sister-in-law Jennifer, David's wife, who'd been quietly observing the conversation while managing their toddler, finally spoke up. "I think it's sweet that Marie has a hobby. My book club leader started selling essential oils online too. It's good to have something to keep busy." Essential oils. Hobby. Keep busy. The words felt like individual slaps, each, one landing with precision. "The important thing," Rachel said, straightening in her chair with the authority of someone who'd never missed a meal or wondered if she could afford rent, "is being realistic about your limitations. You've been through trauma, Marie. Your judgment might not be as clear as you think it is. We're your family. We can see things you can't. My limitations. My unclear judgment. 23 years of making life and death decisions in conditions they couldn't imagine, and they questioned my judgment because I chose to build something instead of applying for someone else's leftovers." David leaned back in his chair, wine, making him more philosophical than usual. "Look, we've all had dreams, Marie. I wanted to be a rock star when I was 25. But at some point, you have to grow up and accept reality. The garage business was a nice try, but it's time to move onto something practical. A nice try. Months of research, of consulting with active duty contacts, of testing prototypes until my fingers bled, of learning manufacturing processes and supply chain logistics and international shipping regulations. A nice try. Besides," my mother added, collecting empty plates with the efficiency of someone who'd hosted 47 Thanksgiving dinners. "You don't want to end up like your cousin Larry, do you? Remember his landscaping business? Lost his house trying to keep that afloat. Cousin Larry, who'd bought equipment he couldn't afford and taken on jobs he couldn't complete, who'd treated business like a hobby instead of a mission. They saw no difference between his weekend warrior approach and what I was building with the focus and discipline that had kept me alive in war zones." The conversation moved on to safer topics: Tyler's grades, Rachel's latest case, David's promotion prospects, but I remained silent, methodically finishing my meal while my family planned my surrender. They spoke around me, about me, but not to me, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person with agency. As the evening wound down and coats were retrieved from the front closet, my mother pulled me aside in the hallway. Her hand on my arm was gentle, her voice lowered to the tone reserved for delivering bad news to children. "Sweetheart, I know you think we're being harsh, but we love you. We've watched you struggle since you came back, and we just want to see you settled and happy. There's no shame in admitting that the business thing isn't working out. Rachel's offer is genuine. She could have you started Monday morning. Benefits, steady hours, no stress about making payroll or dealing with customers. Wouldn't that be nice? Settled and happy. Benefits and steady hours. No stress about building something meaningful, creating something that mattered, proving that a middle-aged female veteran could compete with anyone if she brought enough knowledge, discipline, and determination to the fight." I hugged her goodbye, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with kitchen spices, and said the words she wanted to hear. "I'll think about it, Mom." But as I drove home through the November darkness, past the suburban houses where families were cleaning up their own Thanksgiving disasters, I wasn't thinking about Rachel's administrative assistant position or the safety of someone else's paycheck. I was thinking about the message waiting on my phone from Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, my former commanding officer, who'd been quietly spreading word about my gear among units preparing for deployment. I was thinking about the email from the Small Business Administration about my federal contracting application, about the meeting scheduled for next week with a procurement officer whose questions would determine whether my hobby would be field tested by soldiers whose lives depended on equipment that worked when everything else failed. Most of all, I was thinking about the phone call I'd received 3 days earlier, the one I hadn't mentioned at dinner, the one that would make next Thanksgiving a very different conversation. The call from a journalist named Michael Rodriguez, who'd been researching veteran-owned businesses for a feature article about military innovation in the private sector. "Ms. Santos," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd done his homework. "I've been following your company's development, and I'd like to discuss including you in our upcoming Forbes feature on America's most promising veteran entrepreneurs. Would you be available for an interview?" The drive home from my mother's house took me through the old neighborhoods where I'd grown up, past the elementary school where I'd first learned that being different meant being dismissed. 23 years in the Army. And somehow I was right. Back where I started, defending my choices to people who'd never had to make life-or-death decisions before breakfast. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel as I pulled into my driveway. "Think about Mom's offer. The admin position starts at $45K plus benefits. That's probably more than your garage thing will ever make. Love you. $45,000. To Rachel, that represented security, respectability, a proper life for someone like me. To me, it represented surrender, trading the potential to build something revolutionary for the certainty of answering someone else's phone calls for the next 20 years. I sat in my car for a moment, looking at my house. Nothing special. A modest 3-bedroom ranch in a middle-class neighborhood where the lawns were well-maintained and the neighbors minded their own business. The garage that my family dismissed as a craft hobby sat detached from the house, its overhead door closed against the November cold. From the outside, it looked like any other suburban garage where middle-aged people stored Christmas decorations and exercise equipment they'd forgotten about. Inside my house, I poured a glass of wine and pulled out my laptop, scrolling through the emails that had accumulated during dinner. 3 orders from military contractors looking for custom modifications to existing gear. 2 inquiries from overseas buyers who'd heard about my designs through word-of-mouth recommendations from deployed units. 1 message from a manufacturing consultant in North Carolina who specialized in scaling small operations to meet federal contracting requirements. My family saw a hobby because they measured success by the standards of their own limited experiences. David worked for an insurance company, climbing the corporate ladder one modest promotion at a time. Rachel practiced family law, handling divorces and custody battles for suburban clients who paid her well to solve problems she could understand. My mother had raised children and managed a household with military precision, but she'd never had to manage anything larger than a PTA budget. None of them had ever been responsible for decisions that affected human lives, for equipment that needed to function perfectly when failure meant death. They'd never had to look at a problem and think beyond conventional solutions, never had to innovate under pressure or adapt when established systems failed. The foundation of my business had been laid in Afghanistan during my second deployment, when I watched Sergeant Marcus Webb bleed out because his medic pack had been designed by people who'd never carried one in combat. The organization system failed under stress, the zippers jammed when his hands were shaking, and precious seconds were lost searching for supplies that should have been instantly accessible. Marcus died, not because we lacked the medical knowledge to save him, but because the equipment designed to save lives had been created by engineers who'd never faced the reality of using it. I'd written a detailed report about the equipment failure, submitted it through proper channels, and received a form letter thanking me for my feedback. The same flawed medic packs continued to be issued to new deployments, and more soldiers died because innovation was constrained by bureaucracy and procurement contracts that prioritized cost over effectiveness. That night, in a forward operating base that smelled of diesel fuel and dust, I'd started sketching modifications on the back of an MRE package. Not because I thought I could change the military-industrial complex, but because I couldn't stop seeing Marcus's face, couldn't stop thinking about the seconds that had been stolen from him by poor design. The sketches became prototypes during my third deployment, when I spent off-duty hours modifying equipment with materials scrounged from supply shipments and salvaged from damaged gear. Other soldiers started asking for modifications to their own equipment, improvements to load-bearing systems, organizational solutions for specialized tools, adaptations for different body types and mission requirements. By the time I retired, on medical disability, I had notebooks full of designs and a clear understanding of where military equipment failed in real-world applications. The garage workshop wasn't a middle-aged woman's craft hobby. It was a research and development facility informed by 2 decades of field experience that couldn't be purchased or replicated. My phone rang, interrupting my review of the day's orders. The caller ID showed Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, my former commanding officer who'd been quietly monitoring my post-military transition. "Santos, how was your family dinner?" Sarah's voice carried the warmth of someone who'd shared enough dangerous situations to qualify as family herself. "About what you'd expect. They think I should give up the garage business and become Rachel's administrative assistant." Sarah laughed, but there was an edge to it. Administrative assistant. Right. Because clearly, someone with your background is suited for filing paperwork and scheduling meetings. "They mean well," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "They mean safe," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference. Speaking of which, I have news about the procurement meeting next week. The testing results from the 82nd Airborne came back." I set down my wine glass, my full attention focused on Sarah's words. 3 months earlier, she'd arranged for a small unit-to-field test modified medic packs I'd designed based on the failures I'd witnessed with Marcus. The test had been unofficial, conducted during training exercises that wouldn't generate paperwork or questions from procurement officers who might shut down unauthorized equipment trials. The results were exceptional, Sarah continued. Response times improved by 37% compared to standard issue packs. Organization system performed flawlessly under stress conditions, and soldiers reported significantly improved confidence in their ability to access critical supplies quickly, 37%. In combat medical situations, those percentage points translated directly to saved lives, to soldiers who would return home instead of being carried home. "There's more," Sarah said. "Word got around to other units. I've got inquiries from 3 different divisions about acquiring modified packs for deployment rotations. Official inquiries, Marie, through proper channels." Official inquiries meant federal contracts, meant scaling production beyond my garage workshop, meant proving that my hobby could compete with established defense contractors who'd been supplying the military for decades. "The procurement officer you're meeting with next week, Colonel Martinez, he's seen the testing data. He's also seen your service record and your reports about equipment failures. This isn't a courtesy meeting, Marie. This is a real opportunity." After Sarah hung up, I walked out to the garage and turned on the lights. The space that my family saw as a cluttered workshop revealed itself as something else entirely. A manufacturing facility optimized for precision and efficiency. Custom sewing machines capable of handling tactical fabrics. Testing equipment for stress analysis and durability assessment. Prototyping stations where ideas became reality through careful iteration and refinement. The walls were lined with completed designs, each one addressing a specific failure I'd witnessed or anticipated. Modified load-bearing harnesses that distributed weight more effectively across a soldier's frame. Communication equipment carriers that protected sensitive electronics while maintaining accessibility. Organizational systems that functioned intuitively, under stress, when fine motor skills were compromised by adrenaline and fear. This wasn't a hobby pursued by someone who couldn't handle a real job. This was a mission continued by someone who'd never stopped serving, who'd simply changed the nature of her service from direct action to innovation support. My computer chimed with a new email, this one from Michael Rodriguez at Forbes. Ms. Santos, thank you for agreeing to the interview. I've been reviewing your company's development and I'm impressed by the trajectory. The feature article will focus on veteran entrepreneurs who are disrupting established industries through innovation informed by military experience. Your story fits perfectly with our theme of unlikely success stories that challenge conventional business wisdom. Unlikely success stories, disrupting established industries, challenge conventional business wisdom. These weren't phrases that described hobbies or desperate attempts to avoid real employment. These were descriptions of legitimate business enterprises that created value and solved problems. I opened my business planning software and reviewed the projections I'd been developing over the past 6 months. If the federal contracts materialized, if the testing results led to larger orders, if the manufacturing partnerships I'd been negotiating came together as planned, my garage hobby could generate revenue that would make Rachel's legal practice look modest by comparison. The financial models were conservative, based on documented demand from units I'd already worked with and contracts that were nearly finalized. Even the most cautious projections showed potential for significant growth over the next 18 months, especially if the military adopted my designs for broader distribution. But growth meant decisions that my family couldn't understand. Reinvesting, profits instead of drawing salary, accepting risk instead of seeking security, building for the future instead of settling for the present. It meant continuing to work 18-hour days in a garage while they worked 8-hour days in climate-controlled offices. It meant measuring success by lives saved instead of paychecks deposited. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from my mother. Sweetheart, I talked to Rachel after dinner. She can arrange the interview for Monday morning if you're interested. It would be such a relief to know you're settled. Dad and I worry about you out there all alone, trying to make this work. All alone, trying to make this work. They saw isolation and struggle where I saw focus and determination. They couldn't understand that being alone meant being free to pursue excellence without compromise, to work toward goals that mattered instead of goals that were simply achievable. I turned off the garage lights and locked the door, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of orders to fill, designs to refine, and progress toward something my family couldn't imagine. The Forbes interview was scheduled for next week. The procurement meeting would determine my federal contracting future, and somewhere in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever soldiers were currently deployed, people were using equipment that might fail them the way it had failed Marcus Webb. The choice between Rachel's administrative assistant position and my garage business wasn't really a choice between security and risk. It was a choice between accepting someone else's definition of my limitations and proving that those limitations were illusions created by people who'd never been tested the way I'd been tested. The pattern of dismissal had started long before. Thanksgiving dinner, woven into the fabric of my family's expectations like camouflage threading that was designed to make certain truths invisible. It began the day I announced my retirement from the Army, when I walked into my parents' living room with my medical discharge papers and a plan that didn't align with their vision of what a proper post-military transition should look like. Marie's coming home to figure things out, my mother had told her bridge club friends, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal concern mixed with embarrassment. I'd been standing in the kitchen, overhearing conversations that weren't meant for my ears, but weren't exactly private either. 23 years in the service, and now she needs time to adjust to civilian life. We're hoping she'll find something stable soon. Something stable. Code for something they could explain to their friends without having to discuss IEDs or combat zones or the kinds of experiences that made polite dinner conversation uncomfortable. Rachel had been practicing law for 15 years by then, with a corner office and business cards that impressed people at cocktail parties. David had climbed the corporate ladder at his insurance company, earning promotions that came with retirement plans and health benefits, and all the markers of traditional success. I had scars from shrapnel, a titanium rod in my left leg, and a head full of ideas for equipment modifications that could save lives. none of which translated well to suburban social gatherings. The first time I mentioned starting a business, 6 months after my retirement, David had laughed outright. We were at his house for a barbecue, watching his kids splash in the pool while Jennifer managed the logistics of feeding a dozen family members and neighbors. I'd been explaining my ideas for improving tactical gear design when David interrupted, with the kind of laughter reserved for children who insisted they could fly. "Marie, you can't just start a business," he'd said, flipping burgers with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned whether his next paycheck would arrive on schedule. "You need capital, business plans, marketing strategies. You need to understand profit margins and supply chains and regulatory compliance. This isn't the military where someone hands you a mission and you figure out how to complete it." The irony was breathtaking. David thought the military was simpler than civilian business, as if coordinating logistics for combat operations was somehow less complex than selling insurance policies to suburban families. He couldn't grasp that everything he'd listed — capital, management, strategic planning, supply chain logistics, regulatory compliance — were skills I'd been applying in life-and-death situations for 2 decades. Besides, Jennifer had added, refilling wine glasses with practiced efficiency, the market for military stuff is probably pretty saturated. All those big defense companies have it locked up, don't they? Saturated. As if the fact that soldiers were still dying from equipment failures meant the market had reached optimal efficiency. As if innovation was impossible because established companies had already solved every problem worth solving. Rachel had been more diplomatic but equally dismissive. During one of our monthly coffee meetings, she'd listened patiently to my business concept before offering her professional assessment. "The thing is, Marie, starting a business is incredibly risky, especially in a specialized field like military contracting. The failure rate for new businesses is something like 90% in the first 5 years. And honestly, after everything you've been through with the PTSD and adjusting to civilian life, maybe something with less pressure would be healthier." PTSD. She always circled back to that diagnosis, as if seeking therapy for combat trauma somehow invalidated my cognitive abilities or business judgment. Rachel had never faced anything more dangerous than a hostile divorce proceeding, but she felt qualified to assess my mental fitness for entrepreneurship. "What about teaching?" she'd suggested, stirring artificial sweetener into her latte. "You could substitute teach, maybe work toward getting certified in secondary education. Veterans often make good teachers, and the schedule would give you time to, process everything you've experienced." Process everything. Substitute teaching. The assumption that I needed a gentle, understanding environment where my damaged psyche could heal while I guided teenagers through lessons about safe academic subjects that wouldn't trigger my supposedly fragile mental state. My mother's approach was more subtle but equally corrosive. She never directly criticized my business plans, but she had a talent for undermining confidence through seemingly supportive comments. "I think it's wonderful that you have a project to keep yourself busy," she'd said when I showed her the first prototypes I'd developed in the garage. "It's important to have hobbies after such a traumatic career. Your father took up woodworking when he retired, and it really helped him stay occupied. Hobbies, projects to keep busy, occupational therapy, for veterans who couldn't handle the real world." She'd examined my gear modifications with the same polite interest she showed when Tyler brought home art projects from middle school. Encouraging, but not particularly impressed, supportive but not expectant of any meaningful outcome. The most painful dismissal had come during Rachel's birthday dinner 8 months after I'd started the business. We were at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the servers knew wine pairings and the clientele discussed vacation homes and private school tuitions. Rachel had been describing a complex corporate merger she was handling when the conversation turned to my work. "Marie's still working on her military gear project," my mother had explained to Rachel's colleagues who'd joined us for dinner. "She's very dedicated to it." "Oh, that's interesting," one of the lawyers had responded with professional politeness. Are you working with any of the big defense contractors? I'm developing my own designs, I'd explained, based on equipment failures I observed during deployment. There are significant opportunities for improvement in current tactical gear configurations. The table had gone quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that follows when someone mentions something outside the boundaries of polite conversation. Rachel had quickly redirected the discussion to safer topics, but not before I caught the exchange of glances between her colleagues, the look that said they were humoring the damaged veteran with her therapeutic hobby. Later that evening, Rachel had pulled me aside while we waited for the valet to bring our cars. "Marie, I need to say something, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended," she'd begun, using the tone she probably employed when delivering bad news to clients. "The military gear thing, it's been almost a year now, and I'm not seeing much progress. I know it means something to you, but maybe it's time to consider that it might not be viable as an actual business. There's no shame in admitting that. No progress." She measured progress by her own metrics: billable hours, client acquisitions, revenue growth that could be quantified on quarterly reports. She couldn't see progress in design iterations, prototype testing, relationship building with military, contacts who operated outside civilian business networks. "I've been talking to some of the partners at my firm," she'd continued. "There might be opportunities for someone with your background in our investigative department. Background checks, document research, that sort of thing. It would use your military experience in a practical way, and you'd have the security of working for an established firm." Document research, background checks. Taking my 2 decades of leadership experience and strategic planning expertise and applying them to tasks that paralegals usually handled. Using my military background as a qualification for filing paperwork rather than as a foundation for innovation. The pattern extended beyond immediate family to the broader social circle that defined respectability in their world. At neighborhood gatherings, holiday parties, and chance encounters at the grocery store, the questions were always the same. "What are you doing now that you're out of the service?" "Working on some business projects." "Oh, that's nice. What kind of business?" "Tactical equipment design and manufacturing." "Interesting. Are you working for a company?" "I'm developing my own company." The conversations always followed the same trajectory: initial polite interest, followed by subtle confusion when they realized I wasn't employed by someone else, then gentle suggestions about more traditional career paths that might better suit someone in my situation. My cousin Larry's landscaping failure had become family legend, referenced whenever anyone mentioned entrepreneurial ambitions. Larry had bought expensive equipment he couldn't afford, taken on contracts he couldn't fulfill, and treated business planning like a hobby instead of a discipline. His failure was used as evidence that starting your own business was inherently risky and probably foolish, especially for people without business degrees or corporate experience. The comparison was insulting on multiple levels. Larry had approached business with the same casual attitude he brought to weekend projects: enthusiastic but undisciplined, optimistic but unprepared. I approached business with the same systematic planning and risk assessment that had kept my unit alive in combat zones. But my family couldn't distinguish between Larry's weekend warrior approach and my professional methodology. Even Tyler, my teenage nephew, had absorbed the family narrative about my doomed venture. During a recent visit, he'd asked about my army stuff business, with the kind of polite interest teenagers showed when adults insisted on discussing their boring work. "Are you making any money yet?" he'd asked, scrolling through his phone while we talked. "Some," I'd replied. "It's a growth phase." "My friend's mom tried to start a business selling jewelry online," he'd said. "She lost like $5,000 and had to get a job at the mall. Maybe you should have a backup plan." A backup plan, 15 years old, and he'd already learned that attempting something difficult was probably a mistake, that safety lay in accepting employment from others rather than creating value yourself. The cumulative effect of these interactions was a steady erosion of external support for what I was building. Not the dramatic opposition that could be fought directly, but the subtle undermining that came from people who cared about me but couldn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. They saw a middle-aged woman struggling to adjust to civilian life, pursuing an unrealistic dream because she couldn't accept the practical limitations of her situation. They couldn't see a combat veteran applying hard-earned expertise to solve problems that continued to cost lives, building something meaningful from experience that couldn't be taught in business schools or corporate training programs. The garage. Workshop became my refuge from their well-meaning skepticism, the place where my experience had value and my vision had clarity. But even sanctuary couldn't completely shield me from the weight of their expectations, the pressure to abandon my mission and accept their definition of appropriate post-military adjustment. What they didn't see during those dismissive family gatherings was the encrypted phone calls I received at odd hours. Voices speaking in careful code about equipment failures that couldn't be discussed through normal channels. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen wasn't the only one who'd stayed in contact after my retirement. A network of active duty personnel had quietly formed around the modifications I'd developed. Soldiers who'd witnessed the same equipment failures. I'd experienced and understood what improved gear could mean in operational environments. The first hint that my garage workshop was more than a hobby project came 6 months after my retirement, when Master Sergeant Rodriguez called from a deployment, location he couldn't name. His voice carried the particular exhaustion that came from consecutive missions in hostile territory, and his request was specific enough to indicate he'd been thinking about equipment problems for longer than a casual conversation would suggest. Santos, remember that compact modification you worked up during the Helmand rotation? The one with the quick access panel and the reinforced antenna housing? I remembered. 3 soldiers from Rodriguez's unit had been killed during a communication failure that left them unable to coordinate extraction under fire. The standard-issue radio packs required multiple steps to access backup systems, precious seconds that could determine whether support arrived in time or families received folded flags instead of returning soldiers. I need 12 units, Rodriguez continued. Unofficial procurement through personal funds. Can't go through normal channels because it's not standard issue, but my guys need equipment that works when everything goes sideways. 12 units meant 12 soldiers whose lives might depend on gear I'd designed in my suburban garage. It meant Rodriguez was willing to spend his own money to ensure his people had the best possible equipment, regardless of what procurement regulations dictated. I can have them ready in 2 weeks, I'd told him, already calculating material costs and shipping logistics for a package that couldn't be tracked through normal military supply systems. Price isn't an issue, Rodriguez had said. Quality is the only thing that matters. That first order led to others. Rodriguez's unit field-tested the compacts during operations I wasn't cleared to know about, and word spread through the informal networks that connected deployed soldiers across different theaters. Within 3 months, I was receiving requests from Special Forces units, Marine reconnaissance teams, and Army Rangers who'd heard about modifications that actually improved operational effectiveness. The orders came with specifications that revealed how seriously these soldiers took equipment. Reliability. They weren't asking for cosmetic improvements or features that looked impressive in promotional materials. They wanted gear that functioned better under stress, designs that could save lives when standard equipment failed. Each request taught me something new about operational requirements I hadn't encountered during my own deployments. A Navy SEAL team needed waterproof modifications for amphibious operations. An Air Force pararescue unit required equipment that could function after high-altitude drops. A Marine unit operating in desert environments needed gear that could handle extreme temperature variations and sand infiltration. My garage workshop evolved to meet these demands, equipped with testing apparatus that could simulate the conditions where my equipment would be used. Environmental chambers for temperature and humidity testing. Vibration platforms that replicated the stress of helicopter transport. Immersion tanks for waterproofing verification. The space looked less like a craft hobby and more like a research and development facility, operated by someone who understood the difference between laboratory testing and real-world performance. The manufacturing process required suppliers who could provide materials that met military specifications without requiring military contracts, fabric vendors who dealt in tactical textiles, hardware suppliers who carried components rated for combat environments, electronics distributors who understood the requirements for ruggedized communication equipment. Building these relationships meant proving I was a serious customer, not a hobbyist experimenting with surplus gear. My business checking account reflected transactions that would have surprised my family if they'd seen the monthly statements. Material purchases in four-figure amounts, shipping costs for expedited delivery to overseas locations, equipment investments for manufacturing capability that could scale with demand. The financial activity looked more like a legitimate business operation than the craft project my family imagined. But the most significant indicator that this was more than a garage hobby was the attention I'd begun receiving from organizations that monitored innovation in defense technology. The Small Business Administration had contacted me about federal contracting opportunities specifically designed for veteran-owned businesses that could provide solutions to documented military equipment shortfalls. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a procurement specialist with the Defense Innovation Unit, had called 3 weeks before Thanksgiving to discuss my equipment modifications in the context of broader military modernization efforts. Her questions indicated she'd reviewed detailed reports about field performance of my gear, data that could only have come from official testing or after-action analyses of operational deployments. Ms. Santos, we're seeing consistent feedback about equipment reliability issues in multiple theaters, she'd explained during our phone conversation. Your modifications address several priority areas that have been identified through casualty analysis and equipment failure reports. We'd like to discuss formalization of your development process through official contracting channels. Formalization. Through official contracting channels meant moving from informal relationships with individual soldiers to formal relationships with the defense establishment. It meant my designs would be evaluated by engineers and tested according to military standards and potentially adopted for broader distribution to units that needed better equipment. The process required documentation that demonstrated both technical capability and business viability. Design specifications that proved my modifications actually improved performance, financial records that showed sustainable operations, quality assurance procedures that met defense contracting standards, manufacturing capability assessments that verified I could scale production to meet larger orders. Preparing these documents revealed the true scope of what I'd built during those months when my family thought I was pursuing a therapeutic hobby. Design portfolios that included modifications for 17 different categories of tactical equipment, test data showing performance improvements across multiple operational scenarios, customer feedback from units deployed in 7 different countries, financial projections based on documented demand from sources that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The business plan I'd developed for the SBA review projected revenue growth that would place my company among the top veteran-owned defense contractors within 3 years. Conservative estimates based on existing demand suggested annual revenue potential that exceeded Rachel's law practice income by substantial margins. Optimistic projections that assumed successful federal contracting relationships showed potential for expansion into international markets and development of proprietary technologies that could revolutionize military equipment design. But beyond the financial projections and business metrics was something my family couldn't quantify: the knowledge that equipment I'd designed was saving lives in places they'd never heard of, protecting soldiers whose names would never appear in news reports, enabling missions that kept threats away from suburban neighborhoods where people worried about property taxes and college tuition. The encrypted messages I received weren't just orders for equipment. They were reports from the field about gear performance under conditions that tested every design decision I'd made. A communication pack that maintained signal integrity during a firefight in Afghanistan. a medical kit that enabled field treatment, that saved 3 soldiers who would have died waiting for evacuation, load-bearing equipment that allowed a reconnaissance team to carry additional supplies during an extended operation behind enemy lines. These reports came with details that revealed how closely my equipment was being monitored by people who understood its significance. Performance data that indicated thorough testing under operational conditions. Feedback that demonstrated soldiers trusted their lives to gear I'd designed in my garage. Recommendations for modifications that would improve effectiveness for specific mission types. The network of contacts who provided this feedback represented decades of combined combat experience and expertise that couldn't be purchased or replicated. Through civilian education, they understood equipment requirements from the perspective of people who'd used gear in life-and-death situations, who'd witnessed failures that cost lives, who'd identified improvements that could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. My laptop contained correspondence with active duty personnel in locations across the globe, requests for equipment modifications from units conducting operations that wouldn't be declassified for decades, technical discussions about design improvements that could enhance survivability for soldiers facing threats my family couldn't imagine. The scope of these relationships indicated that my garage business had attracted attention from serious people who dealt with serious problems. Not the attention that came from marketing campaigns or trade show presentations, but the attention that came from producing solutions that worked when nothing else would suffice. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I'd received a call from Colonel Martinez, the procurement officer who would be evaluating my federal contracting application. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd made decisions affecting thousands of soldiers, and his questions demonstrated familiarity with both my equipment and my service record. Mrs. Santos, I've reviewed the testing data from the field. Trials. Your modifications show consistent performance improvements across multiple operational scenarios. We're particularly interested in your medical kit redesign and the communication equipment modifications. Field trials meant my equipment had been tested under actual operational conditions, evaluated by soldiers whose lives depended on gear performance. Performance improvements that could be quantified meant the difference between successful missions and casualties that would be grieved by families who'd never know why their loved ones didn't come home. The preliminary evaluation indicates your designs address priority capability gaps that have been identified through extensive analysis of equipment failure modes, Colonel Martinez had continued. We'd like to schedule a comprehensive review of your manufacturing capability and quality assurance procedures. Priority capability gaps meant problems that had been identified through analysis of why soldiers died, why missions failed, why equipment broke when it was needed most. Addressing these gaps meant preventing future failures, saving lives that would otherwise be lost to inadequate equipment design. The conversation had ended with scheduling details for a site visit that would determine whether my garage workshop met the standards required for federal defense contracting. Not an informal visit from family members who wanted to assess my therapeutic hobby, but a formal evaluation by professionals who understood the difference between adequate equipment and equipment that could save lives. That night, I'd walked through my workshop with fresh eyes, seeing it not as the craft project my family imagined, but as the research and development facility it had actually become. Equipment that could test gear under conditions that simulated combat stress. Manufacturing capability that could produce modifications for soldiers who trusted their lives to my designs. Quality assurance procedures that ensured every piece of equipment would function when failure meant death. The Forbes interview request had arrived the next morning, confirming that my garage business had attracted attention beyond military circles. Journalists who specialized in business innovation, editors who tracked emerging companies in defense technology, analysts who identified trends in veteran entrepreneurship. But none of this was visible to my family when they suggested I abandon my hobby and accept Rachel's administrative assistant position. They measured success by metrics they understood: steady paychecks, health benefits, retirement plans, and couldn't see value in work that didn't conform to their expectations of appropriate civilian employment. while they saw tinkering in a garage. I was actually building Santos Defense Solutions, a defense contracting empire worth $23 million that operated through a carefully constructed network of subsidiary companies and strategic partnerships spanning 3 continents. The garage workshop they dismissed as a hobby was merely the visible tip of an operation that had quietly become one of the most innovative suppliers of specialized tactical equipment to elite military units worldwide. The transformation had begun. 18 months after my retirement, when the informal orders from deployed soldiers had grown into something requiring serious business infrastructure, Master Sergeant Rodriguez's initial request for 12 communication packs had multiplied into standing orders from 17 different special operations units, each requiring customized modifications for specific mission profiles that couldn't be discussed through normal channels. Managing this demand required more than garage-based manufacturing. I'd established Santos Defense Solutions as a Delaware corporation with subsidiary operations in North Carolina, where military contracting expertise was readily available, and partnerships with specialized manufacturers in Tennessee who understood the requirements for defense-grade equipment production. The North Carolina facility operated under the subsidiary name Tactical Innovation Systems, housed in a 40,000-square-foot manufacturing complex that could produce equipment meeting the most stringent military specifications. Former Special Forces personnel managed production lines where every piece of gear was tested according to standards that exceeded normal military requirements. Quality assurance procedures that had been developed through consultation with combat veterans who understood the consequences of equipment failure. Tennessee operations were managed through Advanced Military Solutions, a partnership with manufacturers who'd been producing specialized equipment for Special Operations Command for over a decade. Their expertise in materials science and production scaling allowed my designs to be manufactured at volumes that could meet demand from larger military units, while maintaining the precision that made each modification effective. The financial structure supporting these operations was more complex than anything my family had imagined when they suggested I needed steady employment. Santos Defense Solutions held primary contracts worth over $40 million in projected revenue over the next 3 years. Federal contracting relationships that had been established through the Small Business Administration's Veteran Preference programs, providing access to procurement opportunities specifically reserved for veteran-owned businesses. International operations were managed through Santos Global Defense, a subsidiary that handled contracts with allied military forces who'd learned about my equipment through joint training exercises and operational deployments. British Special Air Service units had adopted my communication pack modifications after field testing during combined operations in Syria. Australian Special Forces had placed orders for medical kit redesigns that had proven superior to their standard equipment during training exercises in hostile environments. The Canadian military had contracted for a complete redesign of their reconnaissance equipment after analysis showed my modifications could reduce mission failure rates by 38% compared to their existing gear. Norwegian forces operating in Arctic conditions had requested cold weather adaptations of my designs, modifications that required research into materials, science, and environmental testing that pushed the boundaries of current equipment capabilities. Managing these international relationships required expertise in export licensing, international shipping regulations, and foreign military sales procedures that were far removed from the simple garage business my family imagined. Legal teams specializing in defense trade regulations, logistics coordinators who understood the requirements for shipping sensitive equipment to overseas military units, financial specialists who managed currency exchanges and international payment systems. The intellectual property portfolio alone represented millions of dollars in documented value. 47 different design modifications that had been tested under operational conditions and proven to improve equipment performance. Patent applications for 12 revolutionary improvements to standard military gear, innovations that could transform how soldiers carried and used essential equipment in combat environments. licensing agreements with 3 major defense contractors who'd recognized the value of my modifications and negotiated deals to incorporate my designs into their own product lines. Royalty arrangements that would generate passive income streams for decades. Compensation for innovations that had emerged from combat experience rather than laboratory research. The research and development capabilities I'd built went far beyond anything my family had observed during their brief visits to my garage. Environmental testing facilities that could simulate conditions from Arctic operations to desert deployments. Stress testing equipment that replicated the physical demands placed on gear during combat operations. Materials research partnerships with universities that specialized in advanced textiles and composite materials. Prototype development had evolved into a systematic process involving collaboration with active duty personnel who provided real-time feedback about equipment performance under operational conditions. Design iterations that were informed by after-action reports from missions where equipment success or failure had determined whether soldiers returned home alive. The manufacturing capability I'd developed could scale from small-batch custom modifications to large-volume production runs that could supply entire military units. Supply chain relationships that ensured access to materials meeting military specifications even during supply shortages that affected other manufacturers. Quality control procedures that guaranteed every piece of equipment would perform as designed when soldiers depended on it for their lives. Financial performance had exceeded every projection I'd developed during the business planning process. Revenue growth of 340% over the previous 18 months, driven by demand that consistently outpaced manufacturing capacity. Profit margins that reflected the premium value provided by equipment that actually improved operational effectiveness rather than simply meeting minimum military standards. The customer base extended far beyond the informal network of soldiers who'd provided my initial orders. Formal contracts with Special Operations Command for equipment that couldn't be sourced through traditional procurement channels. Development agreements with research institutions that were exploring next-generation military technologies. Consulting relationships with defense contractors who needed expertise in translating operational requirements into practical equipment design. Santos Defense Solutions employed 87 people across multiple facilities, including former military personnel who brought operational experience to the manufacturing process, and civilian specialists who provided expertise in business operations, financial management, and regulatory compliance. Employee benefits packages that exceeded industry standards. Profit-sharing arrangements that ensured everyone contributed to and benefited from the company's success. The employee roster included former Navy SEALs, who managed testing and evaluation. Procedures, retired Army Rangers who supervised manufacturing quality control, and former Air Force Special Operations personnel who handled customer liaison and technical support. Civilian employees included MBA graduates who managed financial operations, engineers who specialized in materials science and product development, and logistics experts who coordinated complex shipping requirements for international operations. Corporate partnerships extended beyond manufacturing relationships to include strategic alliances with technology companies developing next-generation military systems. Collaboration agreements with software developers who were creating digital solutions for battlefield communication and coordination. Research partnerships with universities that were exploring advanced materials and manufacturing techniques applicable to military equipment design. The technology integration capabilities I'd developed allowed Santos Defense Solutions to incorporate cutting-edge innovations into traditional military equipment. Communication systems that utilized advanced encryption and satellite networking. Medical equipment that incorporated real-time monitoring and diagnostic capabilities. Load-bearing systems that integrated power generation and distribution for electronic equipment. Santos Defense Solutions had also established a research foundation focused on analyzing equipment failure patterns and developing solutions that could prevent future casualties. The foundation operated independently of the commercial business, funded through a percentage of company profits and dedicated to research that might not have immediate commercial applications. but could save lives through improved equipment design. The Foundation's research had identified 17 critical failure modes in standard military equipment that contributed to preventable casualties during combat operations. Design solutions that could address these failure modes were being developed through collaboration with military medical professionals, combat veterans, and equipment manufacturers who prioritized effectiveness over cost considerations. International recognition of Santos Defense Solutions innovations had led to invitations to present research findings at defense technology conferences in 12 different countries. Speaking engagements at military academies where future officers were learning about the relationship between equipment quality and mission success. Advisory positions with government agencies that were developing policies for military equipment, procurement, and innovation. The company had received formal recognition from the Department of Defense for contributions to soldier safety and mission effectiveness. Awards from veteran business organizations for successful transition from military service to civilian entrepreneurship. Acknowledgement from Special Operations Command for innovations that had directly contributed to successful mission outcomes and reduced casualty rates. But the most meaningful recognition came from soldiers who'd used my equipment in life and death situations and returned home because the gear had performed as designed. Letters from family members who understood that their loved ones had survived dangerous missions, partly because they'd carried equipment that worked when everything else failed. These testimonials represented the true measure of Santos Defense Solutions success, not the financial metrics that impressed business analysts, but the lives saved through equipment that met the actual requirements of combat operations rather than the bureaucratic requirements of procurement systems. The Forbes feature article would reveal all of this to a business audience that specialized in identifying emerging companies with significant growth potential. Recognition that Santos Defense Solutions had achieved something remarkable in the defense contracting industry, building a successful business by prioritizing effectiveness over cost, innovation over compliance with existing standards. As I prepared for the Forbes interview that would change everything my family thought they knew about my garage hobby, I realized that their dismissal had actually been a gift. Their lack of support had forced me to build something that didn't depend on their approval, to prove value through performance rather than through meeting their expectations of appropriate civilian employment. Tomorrow, they would learn that their middle-aged veteran daughter hadn't just survived the transition to civilian life. She'd built an empire that made their traditional career achievements look modest by comparison. The garage business they'd mocked was worth more than all their combined assets, employed more people than Rachel's law firm, and had impact that extended far beyond suburban office buildings and corporate hierarchies. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told your dreams were unrealistic, remember that their limitations aren't your limitations. Sometimes the people who love you most are the least capable of seeing your true potential. Subscribe if you believe that the best response to doubt is success, and that the most powerful revenge is building something so significant that their opinion becomes irrelevant.